Instructor barked, "Grab anything to defend yourself." The Deathworld girl built a full war zone in 30 secs. The chamber smelled of scorched polymer and nervous species, the way it always did before the drill. 14 cadets stood in a grey room 14 meters wide and 14 meters deep. The walls held nothing decorative. The floor held nothing soft. Stacked along the edges were objects from 40 different species: toolkits, poles, cables, padding rolls, crates, folded sheets of insulation, none of them designed to work with anything else in the room. The Academy called this a feature. Telnvac had always agreed. He held the stopwatch in his upper right hand and his field log in his lower left. He had done this 31 times. He knew what the next 90 seconds would look like. What he did not know, what no one in the Gauntletreth had thought to look up, was what planet the small human girl at the back of the group actually came from. Her intake file said Class 9. Her intake file was wrong. Telnvac had reviewed the roster before dawn. Standard rotation. 14 cadets, mixed species, nothing flagged. He'd read each file aloud for the record as he walked the chamber, the way he always did. His field notes demanded a species confidence rating before the drill began, and he took the ritual seriously. He read 11 files without incident. The 12th was Mara Voss, human, Earth origin, 19 years old. The intake sheet described her home planet as a Class 9 garden world. Mild climate, low fauna threat, no documented apex predators in the primary landmass zones. Sub-threshold combatant mass, 61 kilograms, which the Sorasi weight chart flagged in pale yellow under the heading Caution, below minimum combatant classification. No prior fortification training listed. No combat conditioning. No survival record beyond a brief notation that read, Standard Earth education, unremarkable. Telnvac had dictated his opening confidence rating into the log. Human cadet, standard low priority assessment. Expectation, minimum threshold, unlikely. He'd moved on to Cadet 13 without pausing. He did not notice, because there was nothing in the file to make him notice, that the Planetary Classification Database update had propagated 14 months ago and had not yet reached the Gauntletreth's intake system. He did not notice the fraying elastic band she wore around her hair, because elastic bands from Earth did not appear on any known threat classification index. He logged it anyway, one line in a 40-line inventory. Personal item, one worn elastic band, Earth origin, no listed function, no threat classification. Then he moved on. His lung sacs were perfectly stable. This was a routine drill. Drill Warden Ossek Farrell arrived at the observation window at the second rotation bell. He was Threnic, 4 arms, wide shoulders, a frame that filled the window from edge to edge when he stood directly behind it. He had held the lead combat readiness post at the Gauntletreth for 11 consecutive cycles. His record in the spontaneous fortification drill was 31 rotations without a single cadet reaching full threshold, and he wore this the way some instructors wore medals, not with pride, exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a person who has measured a thing carefully and found it to be exactly as difficult as advertised. He uncrossed his upper arms long enough to activate the observation panel, then crossed them again. "Before I issue the command," he said, and the ultrasonic subregister of his voice moved through the glass and landed in the cadet's sternums like a tap from a closed fist, "I will tell you the failure rate for this drill. 81% of cadets do not reach minimum threshold. I mention this so you can manage your expectations, not so you panic. Panic costs time you do not have." He let that sit for a moment. Minimum threshold means a defensible position that would survive a 6-second assault from a standard Threnic combat unit. Full threshold, which no cadet in 31 cycles has ever reached, means a position capable of holding a 60-second multi-vector assault. You have 90 seconds. The materials in this room have been certified species neutral. No cadet has a home environment advantage. You will use what is here. Telnvac noted, for the record, that Cadet Gosvel Kethric, 4-limbed, the largest physical specimen in the cohort, shifted his weight forward when Ossek described the assault unit. He was already reading the room for the heaviest object. Good instinct, probably. Maybe 19 cadets out of 100 would have done the same, and maybe 4 of those 19 would end up near minimum threshold. The numbers had been reliable for a long time. At the back of the group, Mara Voss looked at the room. Not at any one object. At the room itself, the way you might look at a sentence you were about to read rather than a word you were about to say. Telnvac noted, human cadet non-responsive at pre-drill, possibly unfamiliar with the command structure. Will monitor. Grab anything in this room, Osek said, to defend yourself. 13 cadets moved. Mara Voss asked, in a flat and unhurried tone, just the one room or the whole corridor? The room went quiet in a specific way, not the silence of shock, but the silence of a group of people who had each, independently, turned to look at the same thing. Osek Farrell stared at her through the observation glass. His forearms did not move. 2 seconds passed. This room, he said. She nodded once. The nod was not sarcastic, and it was not nervous. It was the nod of someone who had just received a useful piece of information and filed it away. The timer started. Telnvac logged the exchange with a question he did not answer. Human cadet asked about the corridor. Spatial confusion, possibly, or scope clarification. Unclear, timer running. He did not circle back to that note for another 47 seconds. By then, it would mean something different. Stay close. What she builds in the next 60 seconds will either make sense to you immediately, or it will make sense to you later when you find out where she's from. The first 20 seconds went the way they always went. Goswell found the largest object in the room, a Threnic storage crate, reinforced polymer, roughly the mass of a young adult of most bipedal species, and began moving it toward the nearest corner. It was heavy. He was strong. He had moved it 1.8 meters by the time 20 seconds elapsed. The corner he was heading for was the northeast wall, which Telnvac privately noted was not load-bearing, because none of the corners were load-bearing. The room's structural uprights ran through the center, but the crate was still impressive, and Goswell was still trying, and at least he was doing something. Cadet Pelothes, Sorathi, same species as Telnvac, top-rated in pre-drill assessments, was pulling a flat panel toward the south wall and bracing it with what looked like a Velhari rigging stand. She had the right idea. The execution was going to be a problem. The panel was already leaning 2 degrees off true, and she hadn't locked the base yet. But there was time. Maybe. The timer read 18 seconds. 4 other cadets were doing variations of the same thing. Find the heaviest flat surface, drag it to a wall, attempt to brace it. This was the correct response. The drill manual, which Telnvac had read, described this as the standard high-pass approach. Cadets who attempted it had roughly twice the minimum threshold rate of cadets who panicked and froze. Mara Voss was not doing it. She stood in the middle of the room for 4 full seconds after the timer started, just stood there. Telnvac logged this as non-responsive. Then, at the 4-second mark, she walked, not quickly, not slowly, with the pace of someone crossing a room to pick up something they left on the counter, toward the east wall. There was a Threnic ceremonial display strut mounted there. Telnvac had noted it in his pre-drill inventory as ceremonial, decorative, drill demonstration purposes, not a structural element. It was a pole, essentially, 2.5 meters tall, cross-braced at the base, designed to hold signage during formal addresses. Mara reached up and began taking it apart. Not pulling at it, taking it apart methodical joint by joint, the way someone might disassemble a piece of flat-pack furniture they had assembled before. The crossbrace at the base came loose first. She set it aside carefully, then the upper mount, then the vertical pole itself, which she lifted free and set against her shoulder. The load-bearing ones, she said, to nobody in particular, are always the ones that look decorative. Telnvac's lung sacs tightened slightly, not a collapse, just a tightening, the Sorathi equivalent of a frown. He filed, human selecting atypical primary material, Threnic ceremonial strut, not listed as structural. Confidence in standard outcome, 71%, revising down, continuing to observe. At the same time, across the room, Gosvel was still moving the crate. It had now traveled 1.8 meters. He had 38 seconds left and a non-load-bearing corner waiting for him. Telnvac did not note the contrast yet. He would, later, with the kind of clarity that comes from reading your own handwriting and realizing you missed something obvious. The timer hit 38 seconds. Mara had set the display strut upright in the center of the room, not against a wall, which was the standard approach, and was doing something with the Velhari rigging line. Velhari rigging line was listed in the chamber inventory as tension cable, cross-species, not tested for structural load-bearing use. It was used, in its home context, for securing equipment on ship decks in low-gravity transit. Telnvac knew this because he had read the inventory. He had not, until this moment, considered what else you might do with a cable rated to hold equipment in zero-gravity transit. She ran the first cable diagonally, not from the strut to a wall, from the strut up and across to a point she had made by wedging the base crossbrace into the ventilation channel above the east doorway. The channel lip held it. The angle was roughly 40 degrees off vertical. Then she ran a second cable, different direction, different anchor point, the ventilation channel on the opposite wall, the crossbrace of a training stand she had pulled apart without Telnvac noticing she'd done it, which suggested she had done it in the same span of time she was running the first cable. The strut was now held by two diagonal lines running to two anchor points at height. It was not leaning, it was not resting against anything. It was standing, under tension, because the cables were pulling it in two directions at once and the forces balanced. Telnvac looked at what she was building. He looked at it for 3 seconds. His lung sacs collapsed. This was not metaphorical. The bilateral lung sacs of the Sorathi species fold inward under sufficient shock, and Telnvac's did exactly that, a sharp, involuntary compression that left him making no sound at all for 3 seconds, followed by a low harmonic exhale that he could not fully control. He filed, human appears to be constructing a tensioned frame, upright held by cross-vector cable load, not wall contact. This is not in the drill manual. I am not certain what category to apply. Confidence in standard outcome, 54%. Across the room, Pelethes's single wall panel was now listing 12 degrees to port. She was trying to correct it. Her rigging stand had shifted when she leaned the panel against it, and the whole assembly was slowly, steadily, moving in the wrong direction. The timer read 41 seconds. Neither of them, Pelethes nor Telnvac, had 38 seconds to spare for other people's problems. Reading the Partition 1 state report, continuing from exactly where it stopped a timer at 41 seconds, Pelethes's wall listing rung 2 open, moving forward. The rigging line was not rated for what she was doing with it. That was what kept snagging Telnvac's attention. He had the inventory memorized, 34 objects, each one cross-listed as species neutral, none of them flagged for construction use. The Velhari rigging line was on the list specifically because it was inert, it held things in transit, it did not build things, and it required specialized fittings to anchor. Mara had not used the fittings. She had used the ventilation channel lip and the edge of a disassembled training stand base, which were not fittings, and the cable was holding anyway because the angle was right and the load was balanced, and she had apparently known both of those things before she touched the cable. "You don't defend a corner," she said, still working, threading a second length of cable through the joint where the upright met the first diagonal. "You defend a volume." She was not talking to him. She was not talking to anyone in particular. It was the kind of thing someone says when they are thinking out loud in a place where they happen not to be alone. Telnvac wrote it down verbatim. He did not add analysis. He did not yet have a category for it. The timer read 44 seconds. Pelethes's wall came down at 46 seconds. Not catastrophically, it leaned, held for a moment at the 17-degree mark with the kind of stubborn resistance that gives false hope, and then the rigging stand at the base shifted 3 centimeters to the left, and the whole panel followed it down in one slow, decisive movement. It hit the floor with a sound like a flat hand on a table. Pelethes stepped back. She looked at the panel. she looked at the timer. She sat down next to the wreckage, which was the correct decision. She had 30 seconds left and no materials in reach that would produce anything defensible, and spending those 30 seconds running for more objects would only mean she was standing in the open when the assessment ended. Telnvac noted her collapse in his log. Pre-drill assessment had rated her second in the cohort. 31 seconds remaining and she was sitting on the floor. He looked back at the human girl. Mara had added a third cable. It ran from the top of the upright down to a low anchor point, a wedge she had made by jamming the leg of a Kethric display frame into the floor channel along the room's edge. The geometry was not something Telnvac could quickly name. He could see that the upright was now held by 3 cables running in 3 different directions, and that the whole assembly was not leaning. It was not resting against anything. It was standing under tension the way a tent pole stands, which was a thing that required knowing something about load distribution, which was not in the intake file under Standard Earth Education, unremarkable. He filed a note that was less clinical than his earlier ones. Human appears to understand tensioned frame engineering. 3-vector cable load, no wall contact required. I do not have a prior example of this in 31 cycles of this drill. Confidence in standard outcome, 41%. Then he crossed out the percentage and wrote 41% again, because writing it twice made him feel, incorrectly, that he had done something about it. The soft materials were along the east wall. Telnvac had inventoried them as filler, padding rolls, insulation sheets, 2 academic banners, gauntletreth insignia, folded, ceremonial. Every cadet who had moved them in 31 cycles had moved them to sit behind, not to build with. They were soft. They were not structural. Cadets learned quickly that soft materials did not stop assaults. Mara pulled the first banner off the stack at 51 seconds. She began threading it between the cables, not haphazardly, but in a specific layering pattern, tight where the cables met the upright and looser at the edges, like she was filling a gap between 2 hard surfaces with something that would compress rather than break. The second banner went in at a different angle. Then one of the padding rolls cut open along its seam with a clip from her belt kit in about 3 seconds, folded twice, wedged into the layer between the first banner and the main upright. The timer hit 52 seconds. Back home we'd call this a crumple zone, she said, still threading, without looking up. Works the same way whether it's a car door or a... She paused for half a second, whatever this assault unit is exactly. She did not know what a Threnic assault unit was called. This did not appear to bother her. Across the room, Gosvel had abandoned the crate. He had moved it 1.8 meters toward a corner that would not have helped him, and somewhere between the 40-second mark and now he had looked at it, looked at the timer, and decided the effort was finished. He was now trying to tip a large piece of display furniture on its side to use as a horizontal barrier. He had 38 seconds, and the furniture had not yet moved. He was at 0% of minimum threshold, by any instrument Telnvac could name. On the observation deck, Osek Farrell had not moved. His 4 arms were still crossed. He was watching the center of the room with an expression Telnvac could read from 30 meters. The expression of a person who is waiting for something to fail and is beginning to notice that it is taking longer than expected to fail. Telnvac's notes had stopped being clinical at around the 50-second mark. He could see it in his own handwriting. The sentences were getting shorter, the observations less categorical. He had filed the phrase, crumple zone, verbatim, and not added the words, human colloquialism, unclear referent. He had just written it down. He noted, looking at the entry, that this was the first time in 31 cycles of this drill that he had filed a cadet's spoken line, verbatim, without translation or context. He added, human is describing automotive safety engineering. While building a fortification, she does not know the name of the thing she is building to resist. He stared at that sentence for a moment. He filed it anyway. Dread counter, 67. The compression layer was done at 61 seconds. Telnvac, who had spent the previous 9 seconds not filing any notes, now had a problem. He had a pass condition and a fail condition and a category of things that did not fit either one, and Mara Voss had built something in that third category. A tension frame upright with a 3-vector cable load, compression layering between the cable runs, a constructed volume rather than a positioned wall. His instruments said nothing, because he had not yet raised them. He had been writing notes instead. She had 29 seconds left, and she was not stopping. She moved out from behind the structure, not retreating from it, moving around it, and started placing objects in front of it, not randomly. Telnvac watched her set a section of display frame at an angle to the main approach vector from the north doorway, then prop a folded insulation sheet against a second piece of frame at about 45 degrees to the first, then tuck the crate's displaced lid flat on the floor at a point roughly 2 meters ahead of the position, where anyone moving at speed would find their next step shorter than they expected. Nothing she placed was sharp. Nothing was intended to injure. Each piece was set with a small, deliberate intention, the frame section at the right angle to interrupt a stride, the insulation sheet angled to deflect rather than stop, the lid flat where a running foot would find it. If they have to slow down to step over something, she said to no one, that's a second. She set the last piece and straightened up. Seconds are expensive. Telnvac stopped writing. He held his stylus above the log for a moment. Then he lowered it. He read the sentence back to himself, seconds are expensive, and felt, for the first time in this rotation, that his confidence percentage column was not only unhelpful, but possibly wrong in a structural way that he did not yet have the words for. He put down the stylus. He picked up the emergency line. The emergency line connected to Subdirector Hale Contes, who was responsible for senior review of pass thresholds in cases Telnvac could not adjudicate alone. In 31 cycles of running this drill, he had never used it. He had never had to. The pass condition was not difficult to assess. A cadet either built a position or they did not, and the position either held threshold or it did not, and in the cases where it held at minimum, not at anything above minimum, because no cadet had ever reached above minimum. Subdirector, he said, when the line picked up, I need a senior review of the pass threshold. The human cadet appears to be approaching full threshold. He paused. I have never had to calculate full threshold before. There was a silence on the other end that Telnvac interpreted as Hale Contes checking the drill schedule to confirm she was talking to the right assessment station. I'll pull the calculation, she said finally. Yes, Telnvac said, please. He looked back at the chamber. The timer read 67 seconds elapsed. Pelithes was sitting next to her collapsed panel. She was watching Mara with the same expression Telnvac suspected was on his own face, not envy, not admiration, but the specific blankness of a person who is watching something that does not fit their model of the situation and has not yet decided what to replace the model with. The timer hit 68 seconds. 22 seconds left. Telnvac raised his instruments for the first time since the drill began. The display registered the structure in the center of the room and began calculating assault resistance metrics. He watched the number climb. It passed minimum threshold at the 15-second mark. It kept climbing. He lowered the instruments. He picked up the emergency line again and said, Hale Contes, before you run the full threshold calculation, I also need you to tell me what Earth's current planetary classification is in the live registry. Another silence. The live registry, Telnvac repeated, not the intake files. The timer ran to 0. He had not called pass or fail. The line to Hale Contes was still open. Telnvac could hear her pulling up the live registry, the faint sound of a system search running, that particular low tone that meant a database was returning results that were not already cached. The drill chamber was quiet in a way it had not been since the timer started. All 14 cadets had stopped working. 12 of them were watching Mara's structure. 2 were watching Mara. Mara was watching Telnvac. Not impatiently, not nervously, the way someone watches a person they are waiting on because the person is doing something that takes a moment and rushing them would not help. The structure she had built stood in the center of the room under the lights. 3 cables, 1 upright, compression layering across the frame, approach denial geometry fanned out in front of it. It was not large. It was not dramatic. It was the size of a doorway, roughly, and it had the look of something assembled by someone who had done this before in conditions where having something to show for it at the end mattered considerably. "Still there," she said. Telnvac looked at her. "I'm sorry." "The structure," she tilted her head toward it, "still there, just in case you needed to confirm." He had needed to confirm. He did not say so. Hale Contes had not come back on the line yet. Telnvac raised his instruments again. The display had been running its calculation since the 68-second mark, and the number it had settled on was, he looked at it, 74. 74 seconds of assault survival capacity for a multi-vector Threnic combat unit. Full threshold was 60. He looked at the number for a moment. He put the instruments down. "Hale Contes," he said into the emergency line, "disregard the full threshold calculation request." "Already pulled it," she said. "Then disregard the answer to it as well." He paused. "The structure in this chamber has exceeded full threshold. I have confirmed this. What I need from you now is Earth's current planetary classification in the live registry, not the intake files, the live registry." Another silence. "Telnvac," she said, in the tone of someone choosing their words carefully, "the intake file lists Earth as Class 9. "Yes," he said, "I know what the intake file says." The sound of the database search changed pitch slightly, the way it does when a query is reaching across a larger archive. Telnvac waited. In the chamber, no one spoke. Osek Farrell had not moved from the observation window. He was still watching. His 4 arms were still crossed. In the center of the room, Mara had not returned to the structure. She was standing about 2 meters from it, hands loose at her sides, watching Telnvac on the line the way someone stands at a bus stop, present, patient, without urgency. She had 30 seconds left on her original timer. She had not used them. She had asked if they wanted something bigger and then stopped. Telnvac realized he had not yet answered her question. The Academic Council session request came through at the 42nd mark after the timer expired. Hale Contes had escalated automatically, which meant the search had returned something that triggered the escalation protocol, which meant the result was not what the intake file said. Telnvac felt his lung sacs tighten in a different way than before. Not the sharp collapse of shock, a slower pressure, the kind that came from understanding that a situation was larger than the last framework you'd applied to it. He had 31 cycles of data about this drill. He had a cadet who had exceeded full threshold with 30 seconds to spare, standing in front of a structure she had built from species-neutral materials in a species-neutral room, waiting for him to answer a question. He had a database search running that was taking longer than a Class 9 return should take. "Hale Contes," he said quietly, "how long does a Class 9 return take?" "About 2 seconds," she said. "This has been 11. "Yes," she said, "I know." Telnvac walked the perimeter of the structure. He did this not because his instruments needed him to, but because he needed to see it from all 4 sides, and because walking gave him something to do with his body while the database returned whatever it was returning. He moved around the north face first. The approach denial layer she'd placed was exactly what she described, objects positioned at the specific angles that would interrupt a Threnic assault vector, nothing dangerous, everything deliberate. He almost stepped on the flat lid she'd set in the floor. He caught himself and stepped over it. "A second," she'd said, "a second. Seconds are expensive." He walked the east side. The upright was planted in the exact center of the cable network's tension triangle. If you pulled any one cable, the other 2 would compensate. You could not bring this down by targeting the upright. You would have to target all 3 anchor points simultaneously, which would require splitting a single assault unit into 3 subunits, which would halve its effective assault speed and reduce its strike capacity by a third. which meant the 60-second multi-vector test standard might need to be revised upward for a position like this one. Telnvac made a note. He stopped writing halfway through when he realized he was calculating whether the Gauntletreth's own test standards were adequate, and that this was not a thought he had ever had before. He walked the west side. The compression layer was tighter in the middle than at the edges. It was not random packing. She had put the denser material at the center where a strike would land first and left the looser material at the periphery where it would absorb energy as it spread. This was the opposite of the standard cadet approach, which was to put everything at the edges and hope the weight of the barrier was enough. This was, the word came to him, and he filed it before he could second-guess it, engineered. He walked the south side and came back to where he'd started. Mara was still watching him. "You built a crumple zone," he said. "Yes," she said. "Into a fortification." "Yes." He looked at the structure. "That's a car safety term." "It's also a design principle," she said. "Same concept. You want the force to go somewhere it can't hurt anything. You shape the material so it goes there." He wrote this down. He did not add analysis, because the analysis was that she had explained a structural engineering concept by comparing it to a car door, and that he was a credentialed assessor of military fortification trials, and that the concept she had explained was correct. The database search tone changed. Hale Contes came back on the line 23 seconds after Telnvac had stopped walking. "I have the live registry result for Earth," she said. "Go ahead." A pause, not the pause of someone searching, the pause of someone deciding how to say a thing. "The planetary classification was updated 14 months ago," she said. "The update propagated to the main registry and the Species Assessment Index. It did not propagate to the Gauntletreth's intake system. The intake system is running the pre-update file." Telnvac's lung sacs were very still. "What," he said, "is the current classification?" She told him. The number was not 9. Telnvac stood in the drill chamber with his field log in his lower left hand and the emergency line in his upper right, and listened to Hale Contes tell him what Earth actually was, and his lung sacs did not collapse this time. They simply stopped moving for a moment, the way a system pauses before rerouting. On the observation deck, Ossek Farrell's forearms uncrossed. It was the only movement he had made in the last 40 seconds. Telnvac did not see it directly. He was looking at his own notes, but he heard the shift in Ossek's weight through the observation deck floor, the small sound of forearms dropping to sides, and he did not need to look up to understand what it meant. It meant Ossek had heard enough of the line's ambient audio to read the direction of the conversation, and the direction of the conversation had changed something in his certainty, and Ossek Farrell, in 11 consecutive cycles of this posting, had never had something change in his certainty. "Telnvac," Hale Contes said, carefully. "I'm also looking at the materials inventory for the spontaneous fortification drill chamber." "Yes," he said. "Cross-referenced against the correct classification." Another pause. "How many objects did you say were in that room?" 34, he said, "all certified species neutral." 11 of them, she said, "are flagged under the updated classification as Earth familiar construction-grade material." Telnvac looked at the upright, the cables, the compression layer, the approach denial geometry fanned out in front. "Which 11, he said, though he already suspected he knew. She read them out, the Threnic display strut, the Velhari rigging line, the padding rolls, the insulation sheets, the display frame she'd taken the legs from, the flat lid she'd set in the floor. He had put 3 of them in the inventory himself that morning. He had walked past them, catalogued them as species neutral, and moved on. "The room," he said slowly, "that we certified as having no species advantage." "Yes," Hale Contes said. "Is her hardware store?" Hale Contes did not answer immediately. Then, "That is one way to put it." The other cadets were still watching. Telnvac became aware of this because the room had been silent for a long time, and silence, in a room with 14 people. In it is a specific kind of quiet, not empty, but held. 12 cadets who had each failed at some point in the last 90 seconds, watching an assessor walk around a structure that had been built in the same 90 seconds, in the same room, by the same species the intake file had rated lowest in the cohort. Goswell had set down the piece of furniture he had not managed to tip. He was looking at the three-cable tensioned frame with an expression Telnvac recognized from his own experience of encountering a thing that redrew a category boundary. Pelathes, still sitting next to her collapsed panel, had her head tilted at the same angle she used in academic review sessions when she was reconsidering something she'd thought was settled. Mara Voss was looking at Telnvac. "Is that what you meant by defend yourself?" she said, in the same flat, unhurried tone she had used to ask about the corridor, "or did you want something bigger?" The question hung in the air. Telnvac's lung sacs collapsed completely. Not a tightening this time, not a slow pressure, a full bilateral compression, the kind that came with a shock large enough to require the body to stop what it was doing and reroute. He made no sound at all for 4 seconds. When he exhaled, the harmonic was lower than anything he'd produced in this chamber before, so low that Goswell, standing 12 meters away, felt it in his lower ribcage. He looked at the structure. He looked at the exit. He looked finally at Mara Voss, and she was looking back at him with the expression of someone who has asked a reasonable question and is content to wait for a reasonable answer. "No," he said after a moment, "this will do." He was not sure that was true. He was not sure the full measure of what she had done could fit in the phrase, "this will do." But it was the right phrase for right now, in a room full of cadets watching their assessor exhale a harmonic that rattled the ventilation channels, and it had the advantage of being something a person could say without their lung sacs collapsing again. He picked up the emergency line. "Hail Contes," he said, "I need you to add one more item to that cross-reference." "Go ahead." "There is an elastic band on the floor of this chamber. Earth origin. I logged it this morning as a personal item, no threat classification." A pause. "Do you want me to reclassify it?" she asked. Telnvac looked at the elastic band on the floor. It was lying about 2 meters from the south edge of the structure, where it had landed when Mara pulled her hair back before the drill began. Old, fraying, the kind of thing that would have been replaced long ago by anyone who had access to a functioning supply system. "I want you to flag it," he said, "in the intake assessment protocol for every future cohort." He paused. "If an Earth origin cadet arrives with one of these, I want it noted." Noted as what? He thought about this for a moment. "Pre-combat ritual object," he said. "Threat readiness signal." Hail Contes said nothing for a second. Then, "I'll add it to the protocol." The Academic Council convened 53 minutes later. Telnvac knew this because he had submitted the emergency escalation at the moment. Hail Contes confirmed the classification discrepancy, and the Council's standing protocol for classification grade incidents required a quorum within the hour. They made it with 7 minutes to spare. He attended by relay from the assessment station, still in the drill chamber, because no one had formally told him to leave, and he had not wanted to. The chamber looked the same as it had when the timer ran out. The structure stood in the center. The approach denial layer was still fanned out in front of it. The Velhari cables still held the upright without touching a wall. Telnvac had not touched any of it. He was not certain he was allowed to, pending review, and he was not certain he wanted to. He looked at his field log. The last confident entry, confident in the old way, where he had assigned a percentage and believed it, was the one from before the drill began. Every entry after that was either a revision downward or a sentence he had filed without a category attached to it. He had never done that before. He had always had a category. He drew a thin line under the last entry and wrote, "Assessment complete, pass condition, full threshold exceeded, time remaining 30 seconds, recommendation, refer to council." He capped the stylus and put it in his left lower pocket. The council's session lasted 41 minutes. The outcome, delivered by Subdirector Hale Contes in a three-sentence directive read into the formal record, was this: the spontaneous fortification drill was suspended pending a full species classification audit. The Academy's neutral materials certification process would be reviewed and expanded to include a live registry species classification check before any object could be certified neutral. Earth's classification would be corrected in the Gauntletreth's intake system by end of day. There was a fourth item, added by a council member whose name Telnvac did not catch before the relay cut out. A flag in the intake system requiring all future assessors to note, when reading a human cadet's file, that the file's planetary classification data should be verified against the live registry before the confidence rating was assigned. It was a small bureaucratic change. It would affect, at current enrollment figures, perhaps 3 cadets per cycle. Telnvac thought about what 3 cadets per cycle meant over 31 cycles and decided the math was not the point. Osek Farrell submitted his written assessment at the end of the same day. Telnvac saw it because it crossed his desk for co-signature, standard procedure for any assessment involving an outcome outside the established range. He read it twice. It was 11 pages, which was longer than Osek's usual assessments, and it contained, on page 4, the following sentence: the cadet's performance must be classified as anomalous relative to all prior cohort data. Anomalous. Telnvac had been in the Gauntletreth long enough to know that Osek used that word the way a structural engineer uses the word unexpected, not as a compliment, not as a criticism, but as the most accurate available term for a thing that fell outside the model's predictive range. He had never used it before in 31 cycles of assessments. Telnvac noted this without filing it anywhere official. Some things did not need to be in a record to be true. He co-signed the assessment and sent it back. Among the junior instructors, a betting pool that had placed Mara Voss at 3-to-1 odds to fail minimum threshold was dissolved by the end of the second rotation bell. No formal announcement. The participants had simply, one by one, stopped looking at the board. Telnvac found Mara in the corridor outside the assessment station that afternoon. She was walking back toward the cadet barracks. She had changed out of her drill kit. The fraying elastic was back in her hair. She had picked it up off the drill chamber floor on her way out, which Telnvac had noted because he had been watching the floor, and the casual retrieval of an object he had formally designated a pre-combat ritual threat signal was the most purely human thing he had observed in the entire rotation. "Cadet Voss," he said. She stopped and turned. "I am required to ask," he said, "what you would like noted in your file as the source of your construction knowledge." She thought about this for a moment. Not a long moment, 2 or 3 seconds, the way someone thinks about the honest answer to a question that has a complicated answer and a simple one. "We had a lot of bad weather back home," she said. Telnvac looked at her. "Back home," he said, "on Earth." "Yes." He wrote this down. He was not sure it was complete, but he suspected that was intentional, and he also suspected that if he asked a follow-up question, the answer would be equally complete and equally insufficient. He had the feeling, standing in the corridor outside the assessment station, that there was a very large volume of information behind the phrase, bad weather, that Mara Voss had decided, in this moment, was not his to have. She nodded once, the same nod she had given when Osek told her it was just the one room, and turned and walked back toward the barracks. She did not look back. She pulled the elastic out of her hair as she went and put it in her pocket. Telnvac watched the corridor until she was gone. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he went back to his desk and started writing the report. The final field, Report to the Galactic Defense Standards Council, ran 47 pages. Telnvac wrote it over 4 days, which was longer than he had taken for any prior report, and shorter than the material probably warranted. He had made a decision partway through the second day. He would write the document the way it needed to be written, which was plainly, and he would not attempt to soften the part where the Academy's proudest fairness doctrine turned out to have a gap in it the size of a planet's actual threat classification. The Neutral Materials Certification Protocol had surveyed 847 species. Earth had been filed as Class 9 at the time of the survey. The survey had flagged 0 of the 34 objects in the spontaneous fortification drilled chamber as Earth familiar. The updated classification, correctly entered, flagged 11 of them. He wrote this in the report on page 12, plainly, without interpretation. The numbers spoke for themselves, and he had learned, over 4 days of writing, that adding interpretation made the numbers seem smaller rather than larger. The supporting evidence package included 31 photographs. One of them, the only one Telnvac-designated primary evidence, was taken by the chamber's automated assessment recorder at exactly 60 seconds elapsed on the drill timer, 30 seconds remaining. It showed the structure in the center of the room, the upright, the 3 cables, the compression layer, the approach denial geometry spread out in front. In the lower right corner of the photograph, visible only because the recorder's resolution was high enough to catch it, was the elastic band on the floor. Old fraying, Earth origin. Telnvac had written its formal designation in Appendix C of the report. He had thought about this longer than he had thought about most of the other designations, because a designation was a category, and categories were what he did, and he wanted this one to be accurate. Personal preparation indicator, Earth type, he had written. Classification, pre-combat ritual object. Recommend all future intake assessments flag Earth origin elastic bands as a threat readiness signal. He read this back once, decided it was accurate, and moved on. Page 47 was the last page. He had written the summary section twice, once in the formal register of a Standards Council document, which came out to 3 paragraphs and felt like it was describing someone else's story, and once in the plain register of a field note, which came out to 2 sentences and felt accurate. He sent the second version. On the morning the report was filed, Telnvac sat at his desk in the assessment station and looked at the drilled chamber through the small window in the station door. The council's audit team had been in and out for 2 days. The structure was still standing. No one had taken it down yet. Possibly they were waiting for the audit to conclude before they moved anything. Possibly they were not sure who was authorized to move it. He drank the cup of something warm that sat on the left side of his desk. He could not remember making it, and looked at the structure. The upright, the cables, the compression layer, the approach denial geometry still exactly as she had left it, the pieces still at their angles, nothing shifted. He thought about the question she had asked him. Is that what you meant by defend yourself, or did you want something bigger? He had said this will do. He had meant it at the time as the right phrase for a difficult moment. He had spent 4 days writing 47 pages that were, at their core, an attempt to answer the question more fully than this will do. He was not certain, setting down the cup, that 47 pages had been enough. No one had answered her, not really. No one was sure. She had asked if they wanted something bigger. No one answered. No one was sure.